Alfonso Cahero: A Journey into Finance History. Chapter 71, Global Minimum Tax Agreement, 2021. Countries agreed to a global minimum corporate tax rate to prevent tax avoidance. In the corridors of power, where whispered conversations echoed off marble walls, a silent revolution brewed. Governments across the globe, weary of watching multinational corporations dance around tax laws, began to murmur about change. It wasn't just about fairness, it was about the survival of economies strained under the weight of tax avoidance. The seeds of transformation were sown, and a gathering storm loomed on the horizon. The rumblings of discontent had been building for decades. Ordinary citizens, struggling to make ends meet, watched with growing frustration as corporations exploited legal loopholes, funneling profits to tax havens while communities suffered from underfunded public services. The resentment simmered beneath the surface, awaiting the spark that would ignite a movement for change. The seeds of discontent had taken root in the hearts and minds of people worldwide. From bustling metropolises to remote villages, the injustice of corporate tax evasion struck a chord. Families watched as vital resources dwindled, schools lacked funding, and healthcare services struggled to cope. The gap between the haves and have-nots widened, fueling a sense of injustice that refused to be ignored. It wasn't just about the numbers on balance sheets, it was about the impact on real lives. Stories emerged of small businesses crushed under the weight of unfair competition, while multinational corporations amassed fortunes beyond imagination. The inequity gnawed at the collective conscience, driving a growing demand for change that could no longer be ignored. From the halls of power to the streets, a call to arms reverberated. Leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens alike raised their voices in a chorus of discontent, demanding action to address corporate tax avoidance. It was a rallying cry for fairness, for justice, for a system that worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. The call to arms came from unexpected quarters. Politicians from across the ideological spectrum found common ground in the fight against tax evasion, recognizing that it was not a partisan issue, but a matter of fundamental fairness. Business leaders too joined the chorus, understanding that a level playing field was essential for sustainable economic growth. But change never comes without a fight. As momentum for tax reform grew, opponents emerged from the shadows, wielding their considerable influence to protect the status quo. Lobbyists for multinational corporations spared no expense in their efforts to derail the push for a global minimum tax rate, warning of economic catastrophe and job losses if their privileges were threatened. The battle lines were drawn, pitting entrenched interests against those advocating for change. It was a David versus Goliath struggle, with the fate of economies hanging in the balance. But the proponents of tax justice were undeterred, fueled by the conviction that a fairer world was within reach, and they were willing to fight for it, tooth and nail. Despite the formidable opposition, a fragile alliance began to take shape. Leaders from countries large and small recognized that they could not tackle the scourge of tax evasion alone. Behind closed doors, they forged connections and built bridges, setting aside differences in pursuit of a common goal. It was a delicate dance, fraught with political maneuvering and diplomatic intrigue, but the stakes were too high to falter. The alliance stretched across continents, encompassing nations with vastly different priorities and agendas. But amidst the diversity, a shared sense of purpose emerged, a belief that by working together, they could rewrite the rules of the game and usher in a new era of tax fairness. It was a testament to the power of collaboration in the face of adversity, and it laid the foundation for what was to come. And then, the moment of reckoning arrived. Leaders from more than 130 countries converged on a historic summit to hammer out the details of the global minimum tax agreement. The air crackled with tension as negotiators squared off over thorny issues, from the precise rate of taxation to the mechanisms for enforcement. Every word, every comma, was scrutinized and debated as the fate of economies hung in the balance. It was a high-stakes game of brinkmanship, with the eyes of the world watching intently. Outside the summit venue, protesters gathered, demanding bold action to hold corporations accountable. Inside, diplomats and policymakers labored into the night, driven by a sense of urgency to deliver a deal that would stand the test of time. And slowly, painstakingly, the contours of a historic agreement began to take shape. Within the hallowed halls of diplomacy, the negotiations reached a fever pitch. Every word uttered, every proposal made, held the weight of millions of voices clamoring for justice. The air was thick with tension as delegates haggled over the finer points of the agreement, each side fiercely advocating for their interests. But amidst the heated debates and impassioned speeches, a spirit of compromise began to emerge. Diplomats, seasoned in the art of negotiation, sought common ground, inching closer to consensus with each round of talks. It was a delicate balancing act, as countries jockeyed for position while keeping an eye on the greater good. The stakes could not have been higher. Failure was not an option. The world was watching, and the expectations were sky high. And so, fueled by a sense of duty and determination, the negotiators pressed on, navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy with steely resolve. As the negotiations dragged on, fatigue set in, and patience wore thin. But just when it seemed that an impasse was inevitable, a breakthrough occurred. A compromise was reached. A delicate equilibrium struck that satisfied the competing interests of nations large and small. It was a watershed moment, a triumph of diplomacy over discord. The details of the agreement were ironed out, from the establishment of a minimum corporate tax rate to the mechanisms for enforcement and dispute resolution. And as the final draft was circulated among the delegates, a sense of cautious optimism filled the room. But the work was far from over. The agreement still had to be ratified by the respective governments, a process fraught with its own challenges. Yet for the first time in decades, there was hope. A glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, signaling a new chapter in the fight against tax evasion. With the ink barely dry on the agreement, attention turned to the road ahead. Implementing a global minimum tax rate would be no small feat, requiring coordination and cooperation on an unprecedented scale. But the signatories were undeterred, buoyed by the belief that the benefits far outweighed the challenges. For businesses, the new rules meant greater certainty and stability, leveling the playing field and reducing the incentive for aggressive tax planning. For governments, it meant a much-needed boost to revenue streams, enabling them to invest in essential services and infrastructure. And for ordinary citizens, it meant a fairer, more equitable society, where everyone paid their fair share. But achieving these lofty goals would require unwavering commitment and vigilance. The forces of resistance were still at play, lurking in the shadows, ready to exploit any loophole in the agreement. It would be a constant battle, requiring constant adaptation and innovation to stay one step ahead of the tax dodgers. As the dust settled on the negotiations, a sense of cautious optimism pervaded the air. The global minimum tax agreement represented a triumph of collective action, a testament to what could be achieved when nations put aside their differences and worked together for the greater good. But the real work was just beginning. With the agreement in place, attention turned to implementation as governments set about enacting the necessary legislation to bring the new rules into force. It was a Herculean task, requiring coordination across borders and sectors, but the momentum was on their side, and as the first reports of increased tax revenues began to trickle in, a sense of vindication swept through the halls of power. The skeptics had been proven wrong, and the naysayers silenced. The global minimum tax agreement was working, ushering in a new era of tax fairness and economic stability.